Great, welcome. We'll get started. My name is Aimée Christensen, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Sun Valley Institute for Resilience, as well as I have an advisory firm. Thank you for joining us today. It's an incredible moment a few months after Paris to talk about where we are and where we're going. In Paris, we had unprecedented agreement. 196 nations agreed to the climate agreement there, agreed to limit greenhouse gas emissions to 2 degrees or less. Below pre-industrial levels, and actually even went further and aimed toward 1.5 degrees. So previously, governments had agreed to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In Paris, they agreed to reduce emissions well below 2 degrees and aiming to 1.5 degrees. So unprecedented agreement, 195 countries there in Paris, and then 186 nations have already submitted what they will individually do to address climate change through their nationally determined contributions to help reach those goals. And a lot of folks don't realize this, but actually the next slide is a good introduction, that actually, although the targets themselves were not legally binding, what was agreed to in Paris was every nation had to report every 5 years, starting in 2018, with what they were going to do to reach those goals and where we are. So having that transparency and accountability every 5 years, requiring nations to come forward and report on their individual targets, and it allows the world to know, are we on track or not? Now, there's a resource to turn to called Climate Action Tracker, and what it shows us that even with those 186 national commitments that have been made by those countries, even if every nation lives up to those limits as they are right now, it only gets us to 2.7 degrees Celsius. So we're nowhere near 2 degrees, much less 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so what we're going to be talking about here today is where do we go next? How do we accelerate that action, scale it up? What countries can do, what the private sector can do, particularly what finance can do. How are we mobilizing the resources we need to do to accelerate the transformation that we need to be making globally on climate change? And I have a fantastic panel to join me here. I have Dr. Franklin Orr, who's our Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. I have Fred Krupp from an Environmental Defense Fund, who's been leading Environmental Defense Fund for 30 years. We have Jingdong Hua, he's the Treasurer, Vice President Treasurer of the International Finance Corporation. And we have Richard Friend, who is with, hold on, I have to check titles. Richard's the Cavendish Professor of Physics. He's Director of the Winton Program for the Physics of Sustainability and Director of the Maxwell Center at the University of Cambridge. So I'm very pleased that we have 2 scientists on this panel, as well as a finance expert and a policy and markets and business engagement expert. So a really nice range of experts on the panel. To start the conversation about where we are and where we're going and how quickly we can get there, I wanted to turn to Dr. Orr because the United States played a critical role in getting us to an agreement in Paris, starting with a bilateral agreement with China, which was critical to get China to the table to begin to show that we could actually get to a global agreement. And the United States has been working to accelerate the deployment of all of its resources towards these goals. So Dr. Orr, I thought I would start with you, talk about how we got to Paris, the United States role, and more importantly, where you all are going to help accelerate action.
Yeah, so thanks, Amy. I think we are at a point where we will look back on this time as a great acceleration in the transition in energy systems. We really are embarking on a truly major reconfiguration of the energy systems for the planet. And that's a big change. These are big systems. There's a lot to do. But it is interesting to reflect on how we got to the situation in Paris, especially given the results in Copenhagen, which were disappointing, obviously. But a couple of years ago, the United States and China, the 2 presidents stood up and announced quite significant reductions in their own emissions, each in their own way, and it was not an agreement, but it was a parallel announcement. And that really set the tone for what followed in leading up to the Paris negotiations. I think it was an important step. It set both countries to thinking about how they were going to accomplish their goals. But it also gave some cover for an awful lot of other countries who then were in a position to begin to think about how they would make a commitment themselves. And because it was not a binding agreement, it really made it possible to come together in a way that makes significant progress toward that goal. Now, we're not all the way there. This is a big challenge, but the potential for increasing our ambition over time, particularly as evidence accumulates on the climate impact side, all of those give us a mechanism for going forward. So I think it's actually really quite an important step. At the same time, in a set of discussions amongst a smaller group of countries, that led to an announcement by national leaders right at the beginning of the COP21 negotiation. And the announcement was labeled Mission Innovation. On the U.S. side, it really grew out of a series of studies, some by the National Academy of Sciences, some by, well, it was a group called the American Energy Innovation Council, a group of CEOs who really argued that countries like the U.S. were underinvesting in energy R&D. And so out of this came the idea of gathering a smaller group of countries that would commit to seeking a doubling of their energy R&D over a 5-year period. I think as we started into the summer, last summer, we were hoping that we might have half a dozen countries that would sign up. But it turned out there were 20. So 19 countries in addition to the United States signed on to seek to double their energy R&D. Those countries include China and the U.S. And many of the other countries that are involved in the Clean Energy Ministerial. They represent about 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and about 80% of the energy R&D. That, in round numbers, that's about $10 billion a year now, and so we would be talking about a doubling. The U.S. contribution to that is our base is just under $5 billion a year. So we'd be talking about a quite significant increase in the clean energy side of things. Now, this is meant to be across primary energy resources and ways we convert those into energy services, but it is a substantial commitment. And it was paralleled by an announcement by a group called the Breakthrough Energy Coalition of 28 investors led by Bill Gates to provide some private capital, patient capital, that would be willing to invest with longer time frames for energy innovation kinds of things. So there's real progress there. I would say that that there's been real progress over the last 6 or 8 years in this country as well. If you look at costs of renewables like wind and solar, they've come down by about half. LEDs now are 90% lower in price than they were 5 years ago. So we really are on the way on a transition. These are big systems, so it's going to take us some time. But if we start now, pay attention to energy efficiency at every stage of the game, use the tools we have now, and then work hard on the technology development, we can do this.
So I think it's important to call out that you're talking about both the innovation, R&D, early stage, basic research that needs to be happening to accelerate the innovation, to bring down the cost, but it's also about the immediate deployment opportunities. And I think as folks look across the finance arena, the opportunities for early stage investments all the way through to project finance to deploy these technologies, it's all there right now and ready to go. So I wanted to turn actually to Jingdong Hua from the World Bank and IFC to talk about how the bank is helping to support countries in the developing world with meeting their targets, and particularly the role of the private sector in mobilizing their resources into those markets.
Thank you, Aimée. You know, COP21 was a monumental achievement, but now it has been signed. It seems to be the easy part, and the difficult part is really to get it done. And I think to achieve it, we need trillions of dollars of investment. as we know, in not only developing countries, all over the world, governments are so indebted. It's really the task of the world community, but primarily private sector, that will have to make it happen. So from the World Bank Group perspective, including IFC, which is the arm of the World Bank Group that focuses on private sector development, I think we'd like to draw attention to the unproportional impact of climate change to poor people. So the World Bank just recently published a book called The Shockwave. Really draw attention to the fact that if we don't provide social safety net and developing a climate resilience, we're going to force about 100 million people into extreme poverty by the year 2030. So the question is, how do we crowd in the $1 trillion financing from the private sector into renewable energy, into climate resilient project? So this is where the World Bank Group and IFC would like to take that leadership position. So we have made our own commitment that by the year 2020, the World Bank Group's commitment to climate change will be up to about 28% of our total investment in emerging market countries. And for IFC, in addition to our own 28%, right now we are about 22%. Our job is also to crowd in another $13 billion per year from private sector. One of the financing sources is really green bond, and I'm very excited to really share with the audience that green bond as a captive financial vehicle really has an amazing track record over the past 5 years. If you look back to 2010, the green bond market was below $1 billion. Last year it was over $40 billion. And I think this year, if the indication year to date is what we can take for, we probably can double that this year. So green bond will become a financing source. And IFC has been a leader together with World Bank in terms of making this asset class viable, being one of the first global financial entities to issue green bond, helping international community to come up with very high standard of green bond reporting, accountability. These are the things we have been doing. So maybe I'll stop here and we'll come back later on.
Just one quick follow-up. Could you give us an example of a project that would be funded through the green bond system?
Thank you very much. So let me tell you the story about Jordan. Now, Jordan is a country that has electricity shortage, and its electricity up to 2014 has been primarily fossil fuel and imported diesel, right? The total grid level PV solar was only 10 megawatts. So last year, using the proceeds of our green bond, we supported what we call a Seven Sisters project, that is industrial level solar invested by a private sector sponsor on 7 sites with a total generation capacity of 107 megawatts. So we came up with a $270 million financing, including our own money, where we source through green bond, but also crowd in other lenders. So this is just one of the many examples that we have on supporting green finance. In India, we have been supporting rooftop solar, which has been tremendous in terms of bringing solar to rural villages, to places where they are not connected by the grid.
Great. So Dr. Friend, I've been hearing all of this from Department of Energy, from IFC, about the efforts being taken for innovation and deployment of technologies. I'm curious about your position working on technology innovation at the university and what you're seeing in the marketplace. What's happening? What needs to happen? What are you excited about? Give us some good news, maybe.
Yes, lots of good news. Well, traditionally we think of energy as a sort of 19th century business. That, most of the technologies were running pretty well in about 1900. And the sort of innovation period for something substantial to happen has been very, very slow. What we'd really like is a sort of Moore's law to change things quickly. And actually that has happened. It's happened. I'll take the example of solar. where there has been a factor of 10 reduction in cost in the last decade, which is, factors of 10 are sort of Moore's law. And I'll take as a specific example off-grid solar, where the immediate opportunity is to provide lighting in the off-grid world. 1/7 of humanity live without grid electricity. And off-grid solar, that comprises a solar panel, a rechargeable battery, and an LED light. There are 3 factors of 10 that have happened in the last couple of decades. A factor of 10 reduction in the cost of solar panels, a factor of 10 improvement in the efficiency of getting light out of electricity, which has been nitride LEDs. And the lithium-ion battery, we think of it as an expensive item that we have in our cell phones. It's actually the cheapest battery to use off-grid because it has many, many recycle times. Its lifetime in the field is about a factor of 10 better than lead acid. So 3 factors of 10. What's that done? It has reduced the deployed cost of solar electricity in the off-grid world below half the price or the cost of the incumbent technology, which is burning kerosene to get lighting. It needs no subsidy. 20 years ago it was unaffordable. Today it is the cheapest, the most effective, the most liked amongst the consumers when they get it. And that's happened because of technology. So if I can make a push on Paris for a moment, we have a choice. Presumably there's 1 billion people who don't have grid electricity. We want, and they want, to become wealthier in the next few decades. And that requires that they have access to electricity. We could, if we tried hard, do a fantastic job with renewables. It would be possible to provide a solar, wind, whatever powered economy that meets all needs. It's improvements in efficiency of energy usage. I picked out lighting, but it extends more broadly, all making that possible. I worry that if there aren't some pretty dramatic efforts taken in the market, that the incumbent world will push ahead with the grid, and it won't happen as well as it may do. But it's a fantastic opportunity. There's no fundamental economic reason why it shouldn't. So that's an example of what's happened. The real question is what may happen in the future. And I think there are many, many sort of Moore's law opportunities. I think the renewables have had comparatively little effort, both in terms of real development by manufacturing at scale to bring costs down, but also it hasn't actually had the sort of attention of scientists. A lot of what we do is still extremely wasteful. Even today's solar panels use no more than about 20% of the energy in sunlight. I'm sure in maybe 15 years that 20 will be 30%, and that'll just be straight to the bottom line. It's just if a panel produces half as much electricity as again, it's just much, much more profitable. Well, I can run through a great list, but I think across many areas of the generation, storage and use of energy, we have so much further to go. And in the case of solar, I don't see this reduction in price to below $0.50 peak watt plateauing there. I think it's going to go shooting down much further.
It's exciting to hear about the off-grid market, and I think folks don't often realize that if we eliminated just kerosene from lighting use, it would be 50 million cars off the road equivalent. So it's a real impact on greenhouse gas emissions, not just a benefit to development and reducing their energy costs.
And it's a benefit to health. It means that kids actually manage to do homework in the evening. The benefit to humanity is massive.
Yes.
Can I just quickly add, I was just recently in Nairobi where I visited one of the off-grid pioneer called M-Kopa. And exactly what they do is not only providing lighting to rural areas, but the whole value chain, because that's only the first step.
Yeah.
So once because the way it works is that there is a SIM card in the battery, and the supplier would switch on, switch off, depending on your payment habit. And in Kenya, they have M-Pesa. That is, every day you can pay 50 cents. As long as you pay, they will switch on. If you don't pay, well, they give you a bit of grace period, but eventually they will turn it off. So the 300,000 users, very quickly you can identify who are the good credit. Now, if you're a good credit, and they call it cheetah, and then the pretty good credit where they call it giraffe, then they will then call, I'm going to sell you a bigger, because what happens is that you pay $30 and then you pay 50 cents per day. Within a year, you own it. You own it forever, right? But you identify good customers, and then you can sell a bigger solar panel with a TV attached, with internet attached. So that value chain is incredible. So I would urge you to check it out. It's very impressive.
It's exciting, and MCOPA and its competitor,
So-
Off-Grid Electric, have both.
Okay, I'm going to put
Yes.
a pitch in for the UK company, which is Azuri. Which,
Fair enough.
okay, if we're doing this, yes.
MCOPA and Off-Grid Electric are
Yeah,
both United
indeed.
States-based companies, but they've both garnered recently tens of millions of dollars of investment, and they're deploying 10,000 systems a month each in Tanzania and Kenya, so it's a really exciting, rapidly growing market.
And Rwanda, too.
Yes. And so Fred, coming to you, 30 years here, started early in helping to design the market-based systems to help make addressing these issues more cost-effective with the acid rain trading program to start. And now here we are with Paris, with this agreement. I would love your perspective on where we are and where you think the near-term opportunities are going forward.
Well, I agree with your assessment, Aimée, and with the Undersecretary's assessment that Paris was the most successful international negotiating session yet. We've had 21. And this was the first one that I came away feeling like we'd made a big step forward. One of the things I like about the agreement is its humility. If you read the agreement, and it's pretty easy to read, there's 20 pages of kind of introduction and then 20 pages of text, 40 pages in all. We can all do that in a couple of hours if we want. It doesn't say it's going to solve the problem. It's not one of these international pompous documents that's full of itself. It says, hey, this is just a modest first step and we've got to do more. And it sets up a ladder of increasing ambition by setting up the process that you talked about of countries coming back every 5 years and the transparency provisions, universal reporting. That's very promising because it opens the dynamics of celebrating the countries that cut the deepest, and on the other side, name and shame those who are laggards. But to return to what the Undersecretary said, I think the most important point really that's been made this morning is that the fact that China and the United States got together a year and a half ago and announced that they were going to do something, ended the dynamic where countries were saying, we're not going to move until you do, and it's their fault. Suddenly, we have the beginning of the potential of an upward spiral. So I am encouraged, but as you said also, it's hardly enough. And we need to do so much more. I think the research and development initiative, the Department of Energy and the Worldwide Initiative is really important, and Bill Gates is to be congratulated. And I think the green bonds are a very promising start. Having said that, there's a funny thing about money. It tends to flow to places where it can make the most money. And what that means is, I had a conversation this morning coming over here with a fellow who asked me about carbon capture and sequestration. And people have been going at that for a while, but until there's a penalty for putting the carbon pollution into the atmosphere, or a reward for taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, well, people are going to be working that for decades. We have to correct the market flaw and put a price on pollution and have a reward for those who soak the greenhouse gases out of the sky. And when we do that, well, it's a funny thing. For the first time, we will be trying capitalism. Yes. Capitalism is a powerful force. It's the most powerful thing that's ever been invented to organize human ingenuity and entrepreneurs, investors, and inventors. When we try that, as we now are in California, in China in 7 pilots, and one of the commitments President Xi made just last September was to move to a national carbon trading system next year in 2017. As these systems get put in place, as it has existed in Europe, and after the early problems that we all know about, it's been reasonably successful. They need to lower the cap. But as these systems come into place, and the next billionaires will be the people who solve these problems, that's when we can accelerate. So my view is that the road to ambition is going to go through the policies that make pollution cuts pay. And we need to keep our eye on the ball, because that is, the central challenge.
So a follow-up then. We have countries all over the world who've made these commitments under Paris, and what they've focused on is their emission reductions or their transition to renewable energy, but they haven't focused as much on how they're going to do that. Is it a market-based approach, emissions trading? Is it a tax, a carbon tax? I mean, what are you seeing, besides China, who's setting up the emissions trading system, what are you seeing around the world potentially that countries are turning to put that price on carbon? And do we have a shot of that happening here in the United States?
Absolutely. We're seeing in many different places, as big as China or as small as New Zealand, South Korea, we are seeing countries adopting carbon pricing. The Environmental Defense Fund, we've long advocated emissions markets and caps that are guaranteed to be lowered in an emissions trading system, but we're for whatever works. So if a carbon tax can work in a particular country and puts a price on carbon, let's go for it. I think what we're seeing here in the United States is an increasing recognition that there's a lot of ways to solve this problem. We can expand the number of regulations that EPA in the states have. We can micromanage enterprises, and we are doing some of that to good effect. But in the long run, having a system which has the government establishing performance standards and letting businesses and entrepreneurs figure out how to meet them, rewarding them for overachievement, as we've done so successfully for sulfur, that, I think, is going to get us deeper reductions at lower prices, because it inspires a hunt for what are the best opportunities. I mean, I think what we need to see is, remember, Aimée, at the beginning of GATT, there were only 23 countries that were part of this. And soon, because trade has its advantages, countries that are better positioned to produce goods, certain goods at lower prices, can benefit by producing them and importing other goods. Countries wanted to join the club, and the club expanded. We need a carbon markets club, and South Korea and Canada and Germany have been advancing this idea, where those countries that price carbon give each other certain advantages. And I think that will be, a way to spread carbon. I do want to say, thanks to the President of the World Bank and the Secretary General of the UN, there is this high-level panel on carbon pricing, which includes a lot of world leaders, and it's another reason that I am encouraged that we will see this. In the United States, I think the politics are changing as well, and it wouldn't surprise me to see a real opening in our Congress within the next couple of years.
What's interesting, I think people don't realize the level of support globally for carbon pricing. That carbon pricing leadership group, it was well over 50% of global GDP. It was representing well over 50% of nations. Thousands of companies have signed on in support of carbon pricing. And so you're seeing that increasing support and recognition of the opportunities that come from putting a price on carbon and the efficiency. And then the market can fill in and solve the problems. Dr. Orr, I want to follow up on that with you. In the United States, certainly under the Obama administration, the president has used what seems like every lever, every tool at his disposal to work on climate change, starting with our automobile emission standards on up. And so yet to really put a price on carbon, you'd have to engage the Congress to do so. And so I'm just curious, from the administration's perspective, we're in the final year. What are your final priorities in this year? And what are you seeing? Any shifts on the Hill at all? We've seen some polls recently where we've seen there is increasing, as Al Gore said yesterday, increasing Republican support for action on climate change. But just curious for your
You know,
perspective.
I think it's actually useful to step back and take the longer view of these kinds of questions. And we were talking about this a few minutes ago. But if you think back to the 1960s, when we were having a vigorous debate about air pollution and water pollution, and there was California kind of led the way. It was a situation where air quality was bad enough in some parts of California that we decided we had to do something. So California passed some rules, some other states went along. So you can see the parallel here is experimentation at the state level. And then eventually businesses concluded that it was in their interest to have a national set of rules rather than 50 sets of state rules. And so the Clean Air Act passed, Federal Water Pollution Control Act passed, and here we are 45 years later. We have not solved every air or water quality problem. Gosh, it's a whole heck of a lot better than it was. And so it took a while to build the consensus to do that. Well, I think we're at the part of this discussion on climate impacts that we're still building that consensus. I think there is strong support across the political parties for the idea that the technology innovation can provide new markets, that can provide economic benefits, that the idea of energy security is tied to environmental security, and that in thinking about the future going forward, we can find areas of agreement there. So the timing of what that will be, of course, I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that we are making progress toward understanding how to invade the future.
One note I would just add is we haven't really talked that much about the impacts of climate change and what we're already seeing, but this morning in the New York Times they talked about Native American communities in southern Louisiana on the coast who are now having to be relocated, and it really gets into this question of the moral imperative, but also this obligation as we make this transition and make sure that the communities who are being impacted are taken care of and supported, but also places like West Virginia who are losing their coal economy are then brought into and part of this investment opportunity, this business opportunity going forward. And I think it's, we really haven't seen as much of a focus on that, but that really addressed the politics of this. If we're going to have communities losing in this transition, we have to make them part of the upside and the opportunity for it. And I think it's a real challenge, but it's also an opportunity for entrepreneurs and innovators to go into these communities and to support innovation in those communities. So just put that in the conversation, because I know the bank has made it a priority to support communities who are being impacted the worst from this. And I'm just curious about specific programs that you all are up to in helping to bring the economic opportunities of this transition to the developing world, but also to the most impacted communities, small island states, low-lying countries, Bangladesh, others. How are you all working with them to help be part of this and support them as they go through this transition?
Aimée, so before I answer that, let me just say
Sure.
a few words on carbon pricing.
Sure.
This is really remarkable that the global community now recognize the market force has to play the central role, and carbon pricing is really central in creating that market force to get a market going. So a couple of things. Indeed, at COP21, the World Bank Group launched the Global Pricing Leadership Coalition that not only include our own community, but over 70 global businesses that will help to set a reasonable carbon pricing globally. But also, I think what's important that these businesses also committed to have an internal carbon pricing so they can climate proof their own business. So that's tremendously helpful. The second point is that the United States is the grandfather of capital market. The market is so big, it's bigger than all the other countries added up. But I feel like there is a chance that China could become the biggest carbon trading market, given China's commitment. That's also where the World Bank Group, IFC, we have been helping with the 7 pilot in terms of then identify what is the best model before China then unifies and set a nationwide carbon trading platform. Indeed, that would create an incredible market force where investors, institutional investors, financiers and private sectors will tap into that market to make climate financing happen. So that's incredibly exciting. When it comes to vulnerability of small island countries and countries that suffer from El Nino and weather patterns, the World Bank Group for a long time have been working with them on how do we develop adaptation. But also, I'm the treasurer, so I like to talk about financing, is how can we use market force to give government a package of financing so that they don't have to scramble once a disaster happens. So the catastrophe bond is something that the World Bank has been working on, which provides for countries like Philippines, the Caribbean, small island countries, a standby financing facility. So the bond is issued beforehand, but then the proceeds will pay out to the government. So that's one way, to help. The second, which is a social aspect, is that, in addressing the impact of climate change, providing social safety net, that is healthcare, education, and emergency response system, and making sure government have that capability, I think that's the integral part. I mean, it's not necessarily directly to climate, but I think it is the necessary adaptation to make sure that vulnerable people in emergent, urgent situations, they have a way out.
Absolutely. I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience so we can engage in a broader conversation. But just one general question for you all: Are you hopeful about our prospects going forward? Where we are, obviously, we're not currently on track to meet where we need to be. But I'm curious. I mean, are we? I think as investors overall, you're betting on opportunity, and I'm curious from this panel's perspective, Dr. Orr.
Yeah, I am hopeful. I said at the beginning that I think that we can do this, but if you look across the spectrum of the ideas that we've talked about here, that businesses are engaged, there's a vigorous R&D community out there aiming to drive down costs and compete on services in ways that will allow those markets to grow and scale. There are plenty of technical areas where we can do better and where the United States is positioned to lead the world. On the solar cell side, if you just look in the last 5 years of perovskites, for example, they've already made it to the 20% range, which is the conventional solar cell. And they offer so many materials capabilities that there really are lots of opportunities there. In additive manufacturing, we can reduce the energy it takes to make a part, can reduce the weight for the same strength, and reduce the energy use overall. In the fundamental science of high performance computing and thinking about complex systems systems like the grid or our transportation systems, water, all of these systems that are linked in the fabric of modern societies, we can make all of these systems more efficient, and there's a real cost benefit to doing so. So I just see a world of economic opportunity to provide the clean energy systems we need and actually provide a whole lot of jobs along the way. We humans are endlessly inventive when we make up our minds to do so. And I think across the fabric of modern societies now, we have the potential to go after this in a big way as we choose to do so.
Aimée, I'm so grateful that you worded your question, are you hopeful? Because often I get asked a different question, are you optimistic? And a professor of history at Oberlin taught me there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is a prediction that everything's just going to be fine. So we can go to sleep, we can have another glass of wine, it's all going to be okay. Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And there's a lot of things that make me hopeful. Just one I'll mention, which I've been working on the last couple of years, is in the natural gas system. Until recently, people weren't aware of the fact that natural gas, when it's not burned and it escapes from the pipes at the well or in a city distribution system, is methane. And methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years after it's released. Well, this could be depressing, but it makes me hopeful because it's an incredible opportunity. If I told you that we could shut down 1/3 of the world's electric-fired power plants and reduce temperatures over the next 20 years by doing it, well, you'd want to do it if you thought there was a practical way to do it, but it would be pretty hard. Over time, we have to do it, but we couldn't do it over the next couple years. With the natural gas emissions of methane, if we cut them worldwide by the same extent that President Obama and now Prime Minister Trudeau have promised to do in the United States and Canada, 45%, we will lower the temperatures that we would otherwise see on the planet in the next 20 years by the same amount as closing 1/3 of the world's coal-fired power plant. And the cost, is it practical? Well, the cost, based on industry figures that have been collected, would be about 0.5% of the wholesale price of natural gas. Very modest for almost a 50% cut. And we'd bring temperatures down by that amount. So these opportunities that are right in front of us certainly make me hopeful, meaning I've got my sleeves rolled up, and we at the Environmental Defense Fund are definitely working on it.
Good.
Well, I'm certainly hopeful, but we have to turn hope into actions, right? This is where we have to move obstacles at every level. I think the action plan is really intersection between policy change and private sector investment. I'll give you a couple of examples. I think on rooftop solar, what we have found is that the installers, the sponsors, normally, because they are startup companies, they have difficulty accessing financing, right? So how do we then make sure that we work with government, we work with commercial banks, providing credit enhancement, provide risk mitigation, so this is no longer an obstacle, right? These are the action items. And also on the coal-fired power, I know, as our president, I think in an interview today said, there are still quite a large number of countries who are planning new fossil fuel power plants, right? How can we turn climate change into a positive force for economic development rather than confronting poverty reduction and climate change? That's a big topic. So that's something we really have to. So I certainly hope the Moore's Law will continue to prevail so that indeed for those countries who are planning big coal-fired power stations, very soon they'll realize, wait a minute, putting up a solar farm takes 7 months. Building a coal-fired power station may take 3 years and is more costly.
And a lot more jobs in the solar farm.
Exactly. So these are the things that we have to do. Again, let me come back to green bond, right? That is, it's not only in dollar space. We have issued green bond in Indian rupee, Chinese yuan, South African rand, Peruvian soles. So how can you then recycle, using capital market, recycle savings to climate investment in a major way? I think these are the action items that let's all work on so that we can make big progress.
Thanks.
Well, I'm hopeful, of course. I'm almost optimistic. I'm hopeful because I think technologies have advanced actually pretty spectacularly in the last decade, so that we actually do have toolkits that we can deploy without much cost penalty today, and that wasn't the case not many years ago. and it's just the problem of people with money who should know how to invest it. So that's the easy bit. No, it isn't. But that sense that there's a trajectory that gives us the technologies that can actually work, I think, is fantastic. I'm worried that what we're talking about doing at the moment are the easy bits. I mean, just switching off coal-fired power stations is comparatively easy. How much of the really hard stuff we have to do depends on how quickly we switch off the coal power stations. And if you start looking at the projections for achieving CO2 levels that plateau at a level that maintains temperatures at a reasonable level, we have to start sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, and that is inherently expensive. So I hope we can get that sort of sense of urgency that steps that are taken now are so much more cost effective than the rather expensive remediation steps that science tells us we'll be forced to contemplate in another 2 decades.
Absolutely. So questions? Yes.
The top 3 or 4 causes of greenhouse globally.
One of our scientists, or Fred?
Well, power generation, certainly a big factor. Transportation, particularly fossil fuels for gasoline and diesel. Agriculture contributes a fair amount as well, but those are probably the top 3.
So I'd just add that agriculture hasn't sort of got mentioned yet, but the figures do look quite bad.
Absolutely. Yes, in the back.
By what fraction do emissions need to be reduced in order to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target?
By what fraction do the emissions need to be reduced
25%,
to,
50%, more than that?
as far as based upon current projections?
Yeah, by about 80% by 2050 from the 1990 base. Is that?
That's the United Kingdom target.
Yeah.
80% reduction.
It's basically we need to get to carbon neutrality by 2050 around the world, at least, in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And then I'm coming back to the one, yes, and then I'll come up.
Richard, you talked a little bit about sort of policy to drive these off-grid solutions and how the incumbents want to focus on the electric grid. Well, in the U.S., the policy that's probably the biggest subsidy for solar in particular, rooftop solar in particular, is net metering, which is entirely dependent upon the electric grid to kind of proliferate. How do you think, what do you think is the best sort of policy design to encourage, off-grid solutions, which right now are incredibly expensive, like $60,000 or $100,000 for an off-grid residential system, trying to offset a $150 bill? I mean, do you think that there's some adjustment in how we're designing policy?
I'm more familiar with some of the smaller scale systems that will do single households actually in Africa, just through things I've been involved with. And as I said earlier, it requires no subsidy. The problem is one of capital, because any sensible economic model for the consumer is that they rent rather than pay up front. And it requires distribution channels, so the existing distribution networks that are currently not selling it need to sell it. How that scales up, I mean, there's this very interesting proposition that there's the sort of escalator works, that the household that starts off with a sort of 5-watt system that's enough light to keep a modest house well lit in the evening and charge phones. If prosperity carries on rising, that the next iteration is the solar panels that can power information, television, for refrigerators. I think it can grow out of that. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do it from the bottom.
This is a really important question. Thank you for answering it. The way the grid is regulated has basically been the same since Thomas Edison, and it's designed to protect the big centralized incumbents. There's a whole thicket of rules, depending on, in the United States, what state you're in, that prevents good things like demand-side management, energy efficiency, solar. And that thicket needs to be cleared away, and that's a cause that left and right, liberal and conservative, should be able to find common cause on. The Environmental Defense Fund has a large and growing clean energy program to do exactly that. But I also want to shout out to the Precourt Institute, which Dr. Orr headed before his current role and now is co-headed by Arun Majumdar, who talks about the fact that in years past, electricity was helped along by, that electricity has helped computing power. It's now time for computing power to help electricity. But to do that, we need a whole new system of regulations for the grid. It's way too complicated to get in here, but we have material online. In addition to the Precourt Institute, MIT has a project headed by Ignacio Perez Aguirre and from Spain. There's some good effort going on, and there is a need for very different policies.
And the problem in the United States of being state by state, it's very unpredictable. And so we saw what happened recently in Nevada, where you had the incumbent utility say that they did not want net metering anymore. You had too much solar coming on to their mind, and partly because part of how they maintain the grid is the money they make off of selling you electricity. So when they're selling you less electricity, how do they get the money in to maintain the grid, which we all need? And so it's addressing, getting ahead of this, so the utilities are with us instead of against us. And in places like Georgia, you've had really interesting, the state of Georgia, coalitions between the Tea Party community and the environmental community to change the laws, to encourage this adoption of solar and more choice for consumers. But at the same time, they put in place the policies that allowed the utilities to be part of deploying the new solution. So it's the smart policies the EDF and others are trying to get into place and get ahead of it. Yes. Yeah, there we go. Sorry, and then I'll come on.
I have a question regarding the mobilization of private wealth. It has been mentioned here briefly, right? So as you all know, it's about 0.7% of the world population is millionaires and billionaires. They control about 50% of global wealth, about 100 trillion or more. And the sad story is that a lot of that wealth is not mobilized at all under consideration of sustainability topics. It's basically sitting in private banks, foundations that are managed as plain vanilla, hugging benchmarks. But the good news is that a lot of those billionaires are actually really interested in integrating sustainability topics and climate change into how they manage their portfolios. So I'm involved in setting up programs at Harvard and MIT and also in Switzerland, where we work together with those billionaires to develop strategies how they could actually engage their capital in investing into the solutions. So what is your suggestion, what we should tell them, how they should prioritize what they do first? And where should they actually really engage, invest their capital? Should that be through grants for technology, right? Should they adapt their mainstream portfolios? Political activism, there's a big spectrum of what they can do with their wealth. What would be your recommendation, what we should tell them where they should prioritize their efforts, one, and where do you see the major stopping blocks that should be overcome for that?
You know, years ago we had program-related investments from foundations. Now we have impact investing. These are good things, and what you're doing is good. But I have to say that even if some high net worth people don't invest in coal stocks, others will as long as it's profitable. So your question, what's the first thing they should do? The first thing they should do is support putting a price on carbon, because then that will get all the money moving toward the things, the innovations, the deployment of technologies that will lower carbon. That would be my clear priority.
But I would say that across the board, across energy, agriculture, food systems, solutions to get us to this low carbon trajectory we need to be on are ready, from early stage investments. Personally, we've invested in early stage solar to project finance, where you can actually own and invest in solar projects. Very low risk, decent returns, predictable investment opportunities, as well as funds have now been structured and who have track records. I mean, Generation Investment in the Atlantic article gave you a window into their 10-year track record for investing in this space. So I think the good news is right now, yes, absolutely, weigh in on policy, whether you're a business, an investor, otherwise to get the rules right. But there are right now opportunities to mobilize your resources into vehicles that you recognize as an investor, that you can understand the risk and return profiles similar to your traditional investments in this space of making this transition. And this is where the growth is. This is where the growth is for investors to be looking for these opportunities. That's the upside these days. It's not in coal and oil. It's in solving the climate challenge. Coming here.
I'd
like to relate my experience in setting up a 5 megawatt mini grid connected solar plant in Tanzania. I've been working on this for the last 4 years. I have a day job, luckily. It's taken a long time, even though it takes maybe 3 to 6 months to build the plant. It's taken us 4 years to get to all the contracts in place. We're working with OPEC actually and USTDA as well. The returns that we were looking at the beginning of the project are looking very different today because the exchange rates have moved so against us. So the Tanzanian shilling has gone down, the US dollar has strengthened. So the sort of viability of the whole project after all this time and investment in time and money is now looking a little shaky. So I'm just wondering, are there any sort of financial supports that one could look at for exchange risk, especially with developing countries like Tanzania?
Very good question. I think with commodity super cycle ending, dollar shooting up, a lot of private sector investors are suffering because revenue is in local currency. They have to repatriate into dollars. So 2 messages here. Number 1 is that if you generate local currency revenue, I would encourage you to borrow in the same currency. Yeah. The second is that when things are going good, if it's a dollar, finally your dollar liability, we can put on a hedge, right? But not after the dollar has already strengthened. But to the previous, a person, I would say, for those private wealth funds who want to preserve their principal, buy or green bond, those who are much more adventurous, join our project financing. I think in IFC, our green financing investment project generally have a similar return profile with other private sector investment projects that we have had in over 120 countries. Certainly, we can discuss.
Well, I have been told that I'm supposed to be closing the session, and so I would just end by noting that I think what we're seeing is climate change is creating obviously an urgency for action and real risks, but also real opportunities. And I know we have a real opportunity. Bloomberg New Energy Finance has said we need $770 billion to be mobilized into renewables and efficiency to meet the existing emissions targets that nations have announced to get us on track. And so it's a real investment opportunity. I would also take a look at Mercer's report on climate risk. You look at a 4-degree world, there's no hedging a 4-degree world, it's all investment downside. 2-degree world, there's some interesting opportunities across your portfolio. And so looking at some of this research to understand where our risks are, where our opportunities are, and hopefully this panel got you started on that. And please join me in thanking them.